Do you think Australian universities rely too heavily on funding from attracting international students? For a significant period of time now, in fact years, government funding, probably ever since the Dawkins review into higher education in the 80s, government funding has been decreasing as universities were first encouraged, then pushed to strike up private partnerships. And they discovered that international students regarded Australia as a brand very highly and Australian education as a brand very highly. And universities went hell for leather chasing the money. And the University of Queensland in particular has been more effective than most at pursuing the dollars from international full fee paying students. Until recently, or last year really, it sort of has blown up for a range of reasons. But in federal parliament last week, confidential documents were quoted by a senator that apparently revealed the University of Queensland's Vice-Chancellor Peter Hoy received pay incentives to deepen the university's ties with China. Now, a little bit later on today, or this afternoon, I'll be speaking with the Chancellor of the University of Queensland, a former DFAT diplomat, Peter Varghese. But let's go to Liberal Senator James Paterson. He got hold of some leaked documents from a whistleblower and used them to great effect in the Senate last week. James Paterson, thanks for coming on this afternoon.
Good afternoon, Steve.
What most concerns you about the University of Queensland now that you've received these documents from a whistleblower?
I'm supportive of our universities welcoming international students to their campuses. It's good that they have another source of revenue that is not taxpayers or domestic students. It's good for cultural exchanges. Hopefully those students are exposed to ideas here that they wouldn't otherwise be if they only stayed at home and studied. However, universities need to manage the risks posed by a vulnerability of being overexposed to international students, and some of our universities haven't done a very good job with that. And in my view, the University of Queensland is at the top of that list.
Apart from the obvious global downturn, where are they overexposed or not managing their risk properly?
Well, what the documents show that I read out in the Senate last week is that Peter Hoy received a $200,000 bonus on top of his salary of about $1.2 million, and two of the criteria related to his management of the international student intake. One of those criteria required him to diversify the university's exposure to a broader set of international students, not just China, and in the judgment of the Remuneration Committee, he did not achieve that objective. And another of his criteria was to engage with China and to perform well in that task, and he met that objective. And one of the pieces of evidence that the Remuneration Committee provided for that was that 63% of commencing international students in 2020 were expected to come from China. Now, in my view, that is not a good thing to be rewarded with a significant bonus. That is a risk that should have been managed.
Why is it a bad thing? Why is it not a good thing when you get that sort of potential growth?
Well, at the business school at the University of Queensland, they would tell you that that is too risky, that you are not diversifying your sources of income. 63% from just one source is an extraordinary over-dependence on just one source. And that would apply if you're a retailer and your one source of revenue was Woolworths, just as much as it applies to international students. But there's an additional element here, obviously, which is that China is ruled in an authoritarian way by the Chinese Communist Party that has values that are very different to our values here in Australia, and they particularly clash with the values that universities should uphold, like free academic inquiry, freedom of speech, and the right to protest on campus. And I think there's evidence that the university has been compromised on those issues because of its exposure to China.
Compromised in what way? Other than the fact that a CEO, as I'll call the Vice-Chancellor, has got performance benchmarks, is there any evidence they've compromised on their scientific research, their academic inquiry, or the values of an Australian university?
I've got three concrete examples, Steve. The first is that the University of Queensland had a completely inadequate agreement with its Confucius Institute on campus. It contained no protections for academic freedom. It handed extraordinary discretion to Hanban, the global body which oversees Confucius Institutes. We should remember that this is a tool of the Chinese Communist Party for its propaganda overseas. And the university has admitted as much because it is now renegotiating a new contract with Hanban that has much more robust protections. So that they signed one in the first place was worrying. Secondly, the university allowed the Chinese government to directly fund 4 courses taught to Australian university students. including one on China's role in the globe and on human rights. That's a very uncomfortable position for any Australian university to be in, to rely on foreign authoritarian government for funding. And finally,
let me just jump in on that one before you go to your third one. Are there any other universities in Australia that are doing something similar, where a country or a government from overseas directly funds a specific course totally?
Yes, there's one good example that's a comparable one. At the University of Sydney, they have a US Studies Centre. It receives significant funding from US sources, and the US Studies Centre has done the right thing, and they have voluntarily registered on the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme to make sure that those arrangements are transparent to the Australian public.
And the university had not done that? The University of Queensland had not done that?
The Confucius Institute at the University of Queensland refuses to do so.
Refuses? Right.
Yes,
okay.
That's right.
It's okay.
And the third example I have, which I'm sure many of your listeners will be aware of right now, is that a human rights activist at the University of Queensland on these issues in particular, Drew Pavler, is facing expulsion charges from the university right now. Now, I'm not in a position to judge all of the claims made against him by his university, but some of the claims that I've seen reported in the media appear to relate directly to his activism on these issues, and I think that's a very worrying thing for the right to free speech and the right to protest on campus.
My guest is Liberal Senator James Paterson, Liberal Senator from Victoria. Last week in the Senate in Canberra, tabled documents from a whistleblower that highlighted the remuneration of the Vice-Chancellor of the University, Peter Hoy. So you see the incentive payments, I think they call them, as somehow potentially compromising or restricting the Vice-Chancellor's ability to dispassionately pursue the values of the University of Queensland when they're going so hard after fee-paying students from China.
A lot of Australians have wondered for many years why universities have gone so hard in the pursuit of international student income, and particularly students from China. And they wanted an explanation as to why that's the case. There are obviously a lot of explanations of why that's the case, but here's one concrete example. We have a Vice-Chancellor who was financially incentivised to deepen his university's relationship with China, and I think that's a very unwise set of circumstances to put in place.
Universities these days are large businesses, and they're large earners of foreign exchange earnings for Australia. Although he's not called a CEO, a Vice-Chancellor is in essence a chief executive. And at any boardroom in Australia, chief executives have KPIs and they have incentive arrangements struck with the remuneration committee of their company. In other words, as I understand, it's fairly standard practice for a large company to have those sorts of financial incentives in place.
I don't agree with you, Steve. Universities are not businesses. They do not have shareholders. They do not make profits. They are not there simply for the purposes of growing and becoming bigger every year like a lot of listed companies are. They are publicly funded higher education institutions. In many cases, they are established by state or federal governments for the purpose of educating Australian students. And they receive enormous amounts of taxpayers' money in order to do that. In Australia, about $18 billion a year in domestic student support and research support. Yes, they do also seek income from international students and from research partnerships and other arrangements, but they are not a corporation, they are not a business, and they shouldn't behave like one, in my view.
James, you'd be very aware that for many years there's been broad criticism of what is seen as the underfunding by federal governments, not just your government, but previous federal governments as well, of higher education. In other words, you're taking funding away with one hand and then slapping them over pursuing funding with the other hand.
Look, that is a convenient argument made by universities in an attempt to absolve themselves of responsibility for the decisions that they've made. Unfortunately, it doesn't line up with the facts. One of the strongest periods of growth in public funding for universities was in the mid-2000s under the demand-driven system put in place by the Rudd government under Julie Gillard as Higher Education Minister. Public funding for universities was surging. And guess what was also surging at the same time? The international student intake at our universities. So they can't claim that it's because their public funding had been reduced if at a time when their public funding is increasing dramatically, they're also increasing their international students dramatically. They made a conscious decision to go down this path.
I'll be speaking with the Chancellor of the University of Queensland, Peter Varghese, later on today, but as I understand it, he's on the Remuneration Committee of the University of Queensland, and they note that Peter Hoy has improved the international standing of the University of Queensland from about, I think, 90 in the Times Higher Education ratings to around about 54. In other words, that's a really significant lift in sort of the international standing of the University of Queensland under the administration of Peter Hoy? Doesn't he need to be given some credit and financial acknowledgement for that?
In my view, I think the $1.2 million in base pay that he receives is pretty generous. And if universities also feel it's appropriate to grab bonus on top of that, well, that's up to them to justify to the domestic students that they pay and, of course, the taxpayer funds that they receive. But my quibble really isn't with the dollar figure that Peter Hoy is paid, but the incentives that have been put in place for him, which encourage him to deepen the university's dependence on China in a way that I think has compromised them. And to their international rankings, I think the university's reputation has been seriously damaged in the last few years by these sorts of incidents, by the exposures about the Confucius Institutes and Chinese government funding, his role as a senior consultant for Hanban, which is this global Confucius Institute umbrella body. Yes. It's a Chinese Communist Party organ which is designed to promote the interest of the Chinese Communist Party. I don't think any Australian academic should be serving in that capacity.
I could be wrong. I don't think he's any longer a representative of Hanban, but I could be wrong. So please forgive me on that.
Right.
So,
that's right. He did resign.
He did. Okay. So, but let's stand back from this a little bit, Senator Paterson. Australia, current, difficulties or misunderstandings aside, Australia and China are friends, and we want a good, friendly relationship. We like China. We've been there in their growth. Chinese people have been in Australia since the birth of our country. We accept that they have a different value system. We ask them to accept that we have a different value system. Both sides know this. We expect every now and then there'll be misunderstandings and differences of opinion. Surely a mature democracy like Australia should be, I hope, can, have a strong financial relationship with China and accept that the Chinese will want to have their voice heard when they're paying such massive amounts of money to have their students, their young people learn at our universities.
Steve, in my maiden speech, I acknowledge the achievement of the Chinese government in lifting more than 600 million people out of poverty over the last 30 years. It's one of the most profoundly positive events of the late 20th and early 21st centuries.
Unprecedented in human history, as far as I'm aware.
Indeed it is. And it's a genuinely wonderful thing, and Australia has benefited from that too. A lot of the wealth that we've generated in this country in that time has come from that relationship. So I'm a big supporter of a strong trading relationship with China. What I won't accept, though, is any attempt from any foreign government, China or otherwise, to intervene in our domestic politics, to intervene on our university campuses, to threaten our national interests, our values, or our sovereignty. And I don't think any Australian, or let alone any Australian politician, should.
All right. What do you want the University Senate or Remuneration Committee to do?
I want them to live up to the words of the Chancellor, Peter Varghese, as you've said, who has pointed out a number of times that this is a risk for universities and it does need to be managed. And I just don't think the University of Queensland has done a sufficiently good job of managing it. They do need to diversify their international student intake. They need to rely less on it for the significant proportion of revenue that it is, and they need to robustly defend the values of Australian higher education. They need to defend the right to protest on campus. They need to defend the right to free speech for their students. They need to defend academic freedom. And I don't think they've been doing all those things as well as they could over the last few years.
Is it of concern to you that the Chinese Consul General to Queensland was given an honorary, I think, professorship at the university?
Yes, that's a highly unusual arrangement. It should not have been put in place in the first place. And I was very surprised that it has remained in place even after the Foreign Minister, Maurice Payne, rebuked the Consul General for his wildly inappropriate comments after protests at UQ last year. He effectively incited Chinese students to commit acts of violence against other students on campus by saying that they were doing the right thing and defending China's honour after they had assaulted other students on campus. That's completely inappropriate behaviour from a Consul General, and it's even worse from someone who's an honorary professor. UQ should have immediately removed him from that role, and that they didn't do so is yet more evidence of the way that relationship has compromised their independence and their integrity.
This is ABC Radio Brisbane. Steve Austin's my name. I'm speaking with Victorian Liberal Senator James Paterson about the University of Queensland and a speech that Senator Paterson made in Parliament last week. We've received a statement from Peter Varghese, the Chancellor of the University of Queensland. He says that you quoted selectively from the Remuneration Committee's documents to unfairly attack Peter Hoy's character. He says that fees from Chinese students account for approximately 20% of the University of Queensland's revenue, and that China is one of Australia university's largest research partners. Do you accept that they say that it's only 20% of the revenue from China?
That's right. It is 20%. That makes the University of Queensland the second most exposed of any Australian university. The University of Sydney is about 25%. It's an extraordinarily high proportion of revenue coming from just one source, and that's been demonstrated by this coronavirus crisis. Universities are coming to government right now saying they need to be bailed out by taxpayers, when in fact there were independent reports as recently as August last year from the Centre for Independent Studies that warned universities that they were overexposed to China, that warned them that they needed to take steps to protect themselves financially, and no university took up that call and no university acted as they should have.
I appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you very much for coming on, Senator James Paterson.
Thanks, Dave.
Senator James Paterson is a Liberal